The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. As early as 1918, the horrors of chemical attacks on World War I battlefields prompted the International Committee of the Red Cross to characterize chemical weapons as, quote, barbaric inventions that could only be described as criminal. In the years that followed, the international community sought to ban their use and production. More recently, international agreements have set the goal of total eradication of existing chemical weapon stockpiles. Yet, as recent events in Syria demonstrate, the world's citizens have yet to rid themselves of this threat. To help us understand the status of chemical weapons in international law and the gulf between the aims of related international agreements and the global realities on the ground, we're joined by Ryan Scoville, Associate Professor of Law at Marquette University, where he teaches and writes in the areas of international and U.S. foreign relations law. Prior to joining the law school at Marquette, he served as Deputy Attorney General for the state of Idaho. Ryan, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I wonder if we could just start with sort of the history of chemical weapons and the agreements in international law, beginning with sort of that post-World War I period.
Yeah, so there are actually a number of agreements that the international community has reached regarding chemical weapons. I think the earliest significant one was in 1899. It was called the Hague Declaration, and it actually categorically prohibited the use of chemical weapons between the signatories. After that, there was actually a provision in the Versailles Treaty after World War I prohibited Germany from manufacturing or importing chemical weapons. And then finally in 1925, you had the Geneva Protocol, which was, I think, the first truly global multilateral attempt to prohibit the use of these types of arms. And it was significant for, I think, a couple of reasons. One is that whereas the Hague Declaration and the Versailles Treaty had a relatively limited number of signatories, the Geneva Protocol was signed by virtually the entire international community. Today there are a little over 135 states parties to the Geneva Protocol. And so it really sent the signal that the use of these types of weapons is illegal as a matter of international law and should not be tolerated.
So initially the agreements were mainly focusing on use and went beyond in subsequent agreements, didn't it? We were talking about production and then eventually just trying to eliminate them.
Right, yeah. So the earliest agreements, with the exception of the Versailles Treaty and its prohibition on manufacturing, they were all focused exclusively on use. And in that sense, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1997, was pretty innovative. It was the first treaty ever to prohibit the stockpiling, production, or transfer of chemical weapons in addition to use. And so that was a big development in this area of treaty law.
So talk a little bit about how that comes to be. I mean, how does the agreement get drafted? Who's at the table, and what happens after the draft is created?
Well, I think a big impetus behind the Chemical Weapons Convention in particular was the use of chemical weapons by Iraq against the Iranians in their war in the 1980s, and then also by Saddam Hussein against Kurds in Halabja. And so I think inspired a little bit by those events, United States and other major international actors got together. I think non-state actors were influential to a certain extent. NGOs, for example, advocacy groups, they all got together and they drafted these provisions. And I think that there was such a high level of support in the international community that it was actually relatively easy to secure ratification.
And typically, do the provisions get ratified by most of the people who eventually end up ratifying it at one time, or are there holdouts? I mean, this is a longer process?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a drawn-out process for sure. The Chemical Weapons Convention has not had the difficulties that some other treaties have had in that regard. Today, basically every single country in the world is a state party, with about 6 exceptions. Those are Angola, Egypt, Israel, Myanmar, North Korea, and South Sudan. Those are the only countries in the entire world that are not states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And even there's some movement toward ratification. So I think that the CWC has had a relatively easy time securing at least states parties, putting aside adherents once they are treaty members.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that. But presumably Iraq was party to some of the earlier conventions in the 80s. Mm-hmm. Which didn't seem to deter use on their part.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that merely being a member of treaty is going to lead to the state's adherence to all of the treaty requirements, all the treaty norms. And that's been a pretty common critique of international law, even to the extent that these types of agreements are reached. Oftentimes they have limited enforcement mechanisms, and there's a limited capacity for the international community to prevent violations. I think the CWC, though, is sort of unique in that regard as well. It's the first treaty to deal with chemical weapons that actually has detailed verification and enforcement measures. The Geneva Protocol had basically nothing in that regard. And I think that has increased the likelihood of state adherence to the treaty prohibitions.
And, we've seen a number of cases where, people who presumably have stockpiles have been in conflicts, and in some cases in fairly desperate straits that haven't used them. What is the aspect? Is it the treaties that prevent them, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And in some ways, the answer is difficult, but I can venture a couple of guesses. I think that one answer is that because of this succession of treaties to deal with chemical weapons in modern history, there's a certain stigma attached to the use of chemical weapons, and states are reluctant to incur that. Everything else being equal, it makes more sense to use conventional weapons if you can avoid that. On top of that, and maybe even more importantly, the strategic and tactical value of chemical weapons is actually very limited, especially given the developments in conventional weaponry. There are so many powerful conventional weapons today that are available to states around the world that the rationale for using chemical weapons is actually weakened to a large degree.
And I would think the military defense against them is...
Yeah, and militaries, whereas a civilian population may be vulnerable to the use of chemical weapons, the militaries around the world are well equipped to deal with them. Soldiers have gear that they can put on, and they can fight in it. So,
I mean, is it fair to say at some level sort of the chemical weapon use is effectively criminalized?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that given the near universality of the adherence to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and given the prohibitions on killing civilians in warfare, I think that's pretty clear that using chemical weapons is criminal as a matter of international law.
And so one of the goals of the most recent agreements are actually eliminating stockpiles. Where are we in the world with that?
Yeah, so that's been one of the sticking points for the Chemical Weapons Convention. There haven't really been problems with most states parties using chemical weapons for the reasons we've talked about. But a lot of the countries that had chemical weapons prior to the entrance into force of the treaty have had a hard time destroying all of their stockpiles in time. And there are a number of states that fall into this category. First is the United States. The deadline for destruction under the treaty was at the very latest April of 2012. But as of today, we've still only destroyed about 90% of our stockpile. About 10% remains. And the latest projections are that we won't finish until about 2023 with the destruction process. And the delay is not because of bad faith or anything on the part of the United States. We are making sincere efforts to comply. Rather, I think it's mostly because of the environmental and safety hazards created by destruction. You have to find facilities that are capable of doing this in a way that meets EPA regulations, etc. And so as a result of that, we're behind schedule. Russia also has a lot of chemical munitions left. The latest projections with respect to Russia are that about a third of that arsenal remains in place. They started out with 40,000 metric tons, approximately, of these weapons, and more than any other country in the world, basically. And they are not slated to finish until about 2020. The other two states that still have destruction projects to finish are Iraq and Libya. Libya has about half of its arsenal, although its arsenal is much smaller than that of the United States and Russia. And then Iraq joined the Chemical Weapons Convention in 2009, but because of the security situation there, has had a hard time destroying that stockpile. You can't just, given the insurgency and everything, and the risk of terrorism. You don't throw it
in the nearest dumpster and hope for the best.
Yeah, these aren't weapons that you can just take in your backyard and sort of put into a pit to burn.
So what would I see? I mean, I've, obviously you're a lawyer, you're not a scientist, but give us some sense of, if I were to go to a facility where these things are being stored in anticipation of being destroyed, what would I see? What do they look like?
Well, they look like pretty nondescript buildings. They have them scattered throughout the country. There's one in Washington, one in Utah. I think they're building one in Pueblo, Colorado, one in Kentucky, I think one in Alabama, Arkansas. So they're sort of scattered throughout the country, and they're fairly nondescript. I think the difficulty with building them is that you have to put them, for the most part, in remote locations so that they're not just, in a neighborhood with children playing around. They are equipped with very high heat incinerators, more so than sort of standard incinerators that you might have for other types of waste.
So typically how they're destroyed then? The chemicals are just
incineration.
Incinerated,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, although they have other measures that they use as well, including hydrolysis, which is sort of mixing the chemical agents with water, at least to weaken their potency in the interim.
Okay, and so where that's a problem, and what slows the process down? I mean, it sounds like, if someone was at it 24/7, you could get through a fair amount of chemical weapons.
You could, but I think there are a variety of reasons why it's so slow. One is most communities don't want to have any of these facilities anywhere near them. It's sort of the not in my backyard phenomenon. And we've had similar issues with nuclear waste. So that's one factor. On top of that is that because of the sensitivity of the chemicals, there are particularly stringent environmental and safety regulations, and complying with those takes a lot of time.
Okay, well, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'd like to look a bit at where they've been used and how that impacts our current situation in Syria. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about chemical weapons and international law with Ryan Scoville. Well, we talked a little bit about the sort of notorious use of chemical weapons in World War I. Let's just sort of go forward through history and look at some of the other instances where they were actually used on any sort of large scale.
Sure. Well, World War I was the largest scale. I think the projections, or a lot of the historians' calculations, are that about 85,000 German and French soldiers died directly as a result of the use of chemical weapons, which is huge. After World War I, there were a variety of sort of small-scale uses. In the 1920s, the French and the Spanish used mustard gas to help suppress a Berber rebellion in Morocco. In 1930s, the Italians used mustard gas against Ethiopian forces. During World War II, the Japanese used chemical weapons against Chinese forces. And then in the 1980s, you had Iraq using them both against Iran and against the Kurds in the northern part of the country. And then, of course, there have been sort of non-military criminal uses as well, like the Omu Shindiko in Japan in the subway. But the number of incidents is actually relatively small here. I mean, that's basically the totality of it during the course of the last several decades.
So now we fast forward to Syria, and one of the issues was, I think, the administration here declaring this red line. Now, is it in fact a red line? I mean, historically, when we've seen them used before?
Well, historically, it has not been a red line in the sense that the United States has never threatened military action as a result of the use of chemical weapons. In fact, quite the contrary. There were some CIA documents that were, historical documents that were released recently that showed that the United States was actually complicit to a certain extent in Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons against the Iranians in the 1980s. So that's obviously a marked contrast from the current approach of the Obama administration. So in that sense, what we're doing now is pretty unique. And maybe it reflects an evolution in international law. Historically, the prohibition wasn't quite as robust as it is now. There are far more countries in the world that have agreed not to use chemical weapons. There are more international laws against their use. And in that sense, there might be a better argument for the type of red line that Obama was attempting to draw.
Well, and much of the red line sort of rationale was it could be corrosive of the international regimes in general. In other words, if we let this stand, the whole house of cards is going to fall apart. Do you buy that argument?
Well, I buy it to a certain extent. I mean, if we have this international law against the use of chemical weapons in place and then don't do anything when states use chemical weapons, the credibility of the framework is undermined. That being said, Syria, when it used these weapons, was not a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. It was a party to the Geneva Protocol. And so it had agreed not to do precisely what it did. And so, I mean, I guess to a certain extent, it does make sense to say that inaction as a result of usage would weaken the sort of credibility of the regime here.
And the question then that comes to mind is, what sort of reaction is anticipated in the agreements? I mean, is there a very clear resort to force?
Oh, you mean in the Chemical Weapons Convention? Mm-hmm. No, not at all. Insofar as state parties are not in compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention, the remedies are actually very limited. There is a bureaucracy that the treaty body, that the treaty created. It's called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. And the OPCW has, its executive arm has certain authority to recommend actions, remedies against states that are not in compliance with their treaty obligations. But the parties that receive those recommendations have absolutely no obligation to undertake them. So as a matter of the Chemical Weapons Convention itself, there's very little in the way of remedies. Now, the Security Council resolution that was recently passed is sort of a different matter. And the key point there is that at the end of the resolution, there's a provision that says that in the event of non-compliance, the Security Council agrees that it will take action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is essentially the set of provisions in the Charter that says that the Security Council can remedy violations of international law to restore peace and security. And so the question is, if Syria fails to comply with its international obligations, what is the Security Council going to do? And I think that given what Russia has already done to date, that is sort of stand in the way of Security Council action, both to prevent further bloodletting, killing of civilians, and to do anything about chemical weapons. It's pretty clear that even if Syria violates the Security Council resolution, there's not going to be an authorization for military force forthcoming from the Security Council. The only option that seems realistic under Chapter 7, given the Russian position, is diplomatic sanctions or economic sanctions. And even there, I think there's a fair question about what Russia will allow.
And just back up for a moment. What exactly has the government of Syria agreed to in this resolution?
Well, it's agreed to a number of things. First, so it signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it will become a full party in about 2 weeks. It'll enter into force with respect to Syria. So Syria is undertaking all of the substantive obligations that every other treaty member has. That is, you can't use chemical weapons, you can't transfer them, manufacture them, stockpile them, etc. And the Security Council resolution overlaps with those substantive treaty requirements. That is, the resolution also requires that Syria not use, transfer, stockpile, or manufacture chemical weapons. that's one thing that requires. On top of that, the resolution establishes a special verification regime just for Syria. So whereas other state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention have a detailed set of rules pertaining to on-site inspections, challenge inspections, etc., the Security Council establishes that for Syria, there is a detailed set of stringent rules that include a very expedited timeline for compliance. And that timeline in particular is going to be a really interesting issue in the next several months, because it establishes basically that Syria has to get rid of its entire arsenal within about 8 months. It has to have all of the weapons destroyed by about mid-2014. And so one of the key questions in the coming months is going to be whether, in fact, that's a realistic goal.
Right. I mean, as we just said earlier, the U.S. wasn't able to meet its goal. Obviously, it's on a much larger scale, but and that's
right. Well, that's one thing that actually most people don't realize, and that is that the U.S. arsenal is was about 30 times the size of Syria's today, and so that's one reason why it's taken us so long to destroy, as you indicated, and it gives some hope to the idea that Syria might, in fact, be able to get rid of its entire arsenal within 8 months, although there are a number of unique complications that the United States has never had to deal with in destroying its own arsenal as well.
Well, and let's talk about some of those complications. I mean, you know, we're saying that it's problematic when you're setting up your facility to destroy them in a quiet community somewhere in the American countryside. Now, what about if you're in a war zone?
Yeah, so, I mean, that itself is one factor, that this is a war zone. The inspectors it's not clear at all that the inspectors are going to be able to do their job without interruption. Even when they went to the Damascus suburbs a few weeks ago to investigate whether chemical weapons were in fact used, their vehicles were fired on by Syrian military forces. So, I mean, that's obviously something that doesn't occur in the United States when we're attempting to destroy our munitions. On top of that, there are a number of other practical difficulties that remain to be resolved. One is it's not entirely clear where the weapons are going to be destroyed. Are they going to be transferred out of the country to Russia, for example? Are they going to be destroyed within Syria? And if so, what sort of risks does that create with respect to theft or use by, you know, non-state actors, rebel groups, etc.? Beyond that, there's also the question of, you know, whether or not other states are going to provide assistance. The OPCW and its inspectors have never operated in a context like this before. They can rely to a certain extent on assistance from UN inspectors who worked in Iraq and their expertise. And I think that you're going to find teams of both in Syria to complete the project. But to a certain extent, this is uncharted territory for the OPCW.
Well, you know, one of the other issues that's come up, President Obama said, for example, that the reason this demands action is it so flies in the face of internationally recognized norms with regard to the use of chemical weapons. And others have said, well, you know, chemical weapon or a bullet to the head, you're still dead. I mean, what's unique about the use of chemical weapons?
Well, I'm sort of the view that the distinction is not all that persuasive. So, like you said, the end result is similar for both types of weapons, right? Now, I think you can make an argument, at least, that chemical weapons are heinous in the sense that they sort of result in needless suffering. They don't kill immediately, and to that extent, maybe they are unique, but I don't see a really persuasive argument that that degree of difference warrants different treatment by the United States. After all, killing civilians is also a violation of international law, and so, you know, people have been arguing on that basis that the United States should have intervened in Syria a long time ago.
And so, you know, if you move into the realm of sort of domestic political strategy, what made it different? I mean, yeah, obviously there was a tremendous amount of death and suffering and dislocation of civilians in the run-up to the use of chemical weapons. Now, what?
I don't know. I've been perplexed by that very question for a long time. I don't understand why chemical weapons would warrant a unilateral military intervention in Syria when the death of 100,000 civilians does not. I don't know. That is not something that has been well explained by the administration. or by anyone else.
Well, looking forward, what's your best guess? Is Syria going to be able to make it?
Make it in the sense of
complying with the agreement? And if not, then what? Not much?
Well, I'm skeptical for a lot of the reasons we've talked about. One other reason why I'm skeptical, though, is that there's a doctrine of international law that says that treaty obligations are only effective on states if they are taken on voluntarily. You can't force a state, you can't coerce a state to accept treaty obligations. And I think that in the event of future non-compliance by Syria, there's a good argument by Syria that the Chemical Weapons Convention is not binding on it. Why? Because it was essentially forced on Syria coercively. The United States threatened military action if Syria didn't undertake these obligations. That's a quintessential example of a treaty relationship that is established in violation of international law and is invalid.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that.
Okay.
Ryan Scoville, thank you very much. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.